you don't take the steps to be proactive and create your own legacy plan, if you will, or your own will or a trust or wherever that might be, your succession plan, the government will do that for you because you've got to, deal with your assets. And so it almost makes intuitive sense. If you happen to own real estate, let's say that you do move abroad, but you have family members back and you own a piece of real estate. If you were not to take the steps to plan and something happened to you, we still have to deal with that real estate, and we have to make sure it can be transferred from you, who was the owner that's no longer here, to whoever's going to buy it next, so that the property can transfer. But if you're not here to sign the deed, how do we get that done? Because the only way to transfer property is via a deed, and so that's why an estate becomes so important. And if you take steps to put things in place yourself, you can be proactive to make sure that the things that you care about are priorities, your family, and less important, certainly creditors and whatever, governmental taxes that might be due. If you allow the government to take the responsibility for planning your estate and you're not here anymore, what do you think the priorities to the government is going to be? It's going to be the government. And then secondarily, your creditors. And last on that list is going to come your family. And so just if we stopped right there and didn't go any further, thinking about it, it makes sense for us to go and plan because our priorities are going to be very, very different than what the government's priorities are.
Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you so much for joining me again today. So today we're talking about estate planning specifically for our expats and what you need to consider before you leave the country, or can you do this while you left the country? Or let's talk about it. We have attorney Obren Barnes. Hey, Obren, how are you?
Hey, Cinnamon, how are you?
I am doing well. Thanks for joining us. So Obren is the guy to talk to about estate planning. And so one of the things that you may know that I'm an advocate of just preparing just in case something goes wrong. So, a lot of times when we talk about moving abroad, we don't consider what happens if something happens to us. Not to make this a morbid conversation, but it's definitely some things that we need to consider, particularly if you have children, if you want to protect your legacy, if you have any parents that are growing older and you may have to take care of them, what happens in that type of thing. So Obren is here to help us with that information. So Obren, just have a couple questions. So when someone's moving abroad and they have children or elderly parents, what are some of the things that they should consider?
Well, I think some of the things, and probably not too dissimilar than what you would think about just in terms of day to day. One of the things you mentioned a moment ago is you didn't want the conversation to be morbid. And what I find is that many times people think that if we talk about death today, they think they're going to end up dying tomorrow. And the reality is that that's not going to happen. You may die tomorrow, but it's not because we're having this conversation today. And the reality is that I think, people need to really be proactive and think about the impact of what could happen because the unexpected can happen. And I think if you're relocating out of the United States and you're moving abroad, you need to be more conscious of that because you're going probably into unknown territory and you just don't know what might happen. And it's not just about if you were to pass away and die, but it's also if you were to also become disabled or incapacitated or find yourself in an accident or something like that. So I think some of the things you need to think about certainly is start to do some planning as to what would be important to you if for whatever reason you became incapacitated or disabled abroad. Or two, if you were to pass away being abroad, and if you have, family members, elderly parents, special needs kids that are back stateside, how are you going to take steps to prepare for them and make sure they're going to be taken care of if something were to happen to you?
And that's a really good point because, of course, my audience, we're either interested in moving abroad or we have moved abroad. But this is not something that you should do only if you're moving abroad. Estate planning is important just in general. I think the thing that's important to understand here is that when you're coming from the U.S. to another country, of course, taxes is one of the issues. But the reason why estate planning, which I didn't know until Obren and I were having conversations as to why it's so important, because if you don't have one, talk about what happens when you pass away and you have assets and you haven't planned accordingly.
Absolutely. So because your assets have to be addressed, if you don't take the steps to be proactive and create your own legacy plan, if you will, or your own will or a trust or wherever that might be, your succession plan, the government will do that for you because we've got to, deal with your assets. And so it almost makes intuitive sense. If you happen to own real estate, let's say that you do move abroad, but you have family members back and you own a piece of real estate. If you were not to take the steps to plan and something happened to you, we still have to deal with that real estate, and we have to make sure it can be transferred from you, who was the owner that's no longer here, to whoever's going to buy it next, so that the property can transfer. But if you're not here to sign the deed, how do we get that done? Because the only way to transfer property is via a deed. And so that's why an estate becomes so important. And if you take steps to put things in place yourself, you can be proactive and make sure that the things that you care about are priorities, your family, and less important, certainly creditors and whatever, governmental taxes that might be due. If you allow the government to take the responsibility for planning your estate and you're not here anymore, what do you think the priorities to the government is going to be? It's going to be the government. And then secondarily, your creditors. And last on that list is going to come your family. And so just if we stopped right there and didn't go any further, thinking about it, it makes sense for us to go and plan because our priorities are going to be very, very different than what the government's priorities are.
Absolutely. And so for those of you who are moving abroad and you are still leaving property in the United States, you really need to think about what you're doing, because God forbid if something happens, it's going to create chaos for anyone that you have in your family that's supposed to be, taking care of that for you, or if you have tenants in it. Like, this is super, super important, particularly if you're leaving the country, because you're just going to complicate things a lot. So Obren's going to do a free masterclass so that we can talk about estate planning in general. Even if you're not moving abroad, it still is important, obviously. But of course, a lot of things can happen abroad and people get super confused, from insurance to estate plans and stuff like that. So, when we're moving abroad, we just want to be a little bit more educated and be prepared for the unexpected. Now, so when we talk about estate planning, is there a way to kind of benefit from estate planning as you're living?
Yeah, well, absolutely. And I want to make one point that's really important about what you said a moment ago. And particularly if you're moving abroad and you have real estate. Because one of the things that you can do is you can move your real estate into your revocable living trust. And then you can still be your trustee, but you can also appoint a trustee that would be stateside as well to be able to handle your property, your real estate while you are abroad. If something were to happen, you've already empowered, by virtue of the documents that you created, your trustee to be able to step into the shoes of you to handle any issues that may arise. They're already going to have the trustee's powers. They're going to have what they need to be able to deal with your mortgage company or any other governmental body, because you will have already empowered them by preparing the documents that would need to be in place. And so if you're moving abroad, that's really, really important, because you're going to want to have a caretaker stateside to make sure that your property is taken care of and the people that are living in it can handle the things that may need to be done as you move ahead.
No, that's a really good point. So is that how you're able to benefit as you're living?
Well, I think one of the ways, but probably more than anything else, is probably peace of mind. I mean, again, one of the biggest issues is that people tend not to think about their own mortality. And I get it. I don't want to think about dying either. But if you take a moment to think about, the disarray that can be left if you haven't taken steps to be proactive, that can be pretty challenging. If you thought about that one time every day, it would keep you up at night. So certainly if you take steps and be proactive to put things in place, yes, there's a benefit for why you're living, because you've already attended to those things. And on some level, we spend so much time particularly, in your income earning years, trying to build that legacy so that will allow you to retire or allow, you to live the lifestyle you want to live. But we don't necessarily go that last step to make sure that, once we're not here anymore, how do those things get transferred? And it's important. I think peace of mind is probably the greatest thing because you can sleep easier at night knowing that you're taking care of some very important things you need to take care of.
Right. And as people of color, like, we're not the ones that really, take this seriously. And so when it comes to our assets that we work so hard to create, they go to the government. I mean, when you think about large families and wealthy families, they used estate planning, and
Absolutely.
that is how it stayed out of the federal government. So if you have children that you're leaving behind when you leave the country, or again, assets, property. But so talk to the people like myself who don't have kids, not married, in my opinion, which I probably shouldn't think like that. If I die, I die. I need to stop acting like that. But what benefit, or what would be the need, or is there a need for people who are single with no children?
Yeah, I think that you still have assets and you still have things that you would want to leave to somebody else. And having the ability to have the control to be able to say what you want to go to, whom you want it to go to, is pretty important, as opposed to just simply leaving that piece undone. It may not be necessarily as compelling if you're not taking care of an elderly parent, if you don't have children, if you're not married and you're single. It may not be as much urgency, but still, if something were to happen, we've got to deal with the things that you have, and there needs to be some type of plan to address those issues. And certainly, people, depending on this particular personal situation, have greater needs and motivation to estate plan than others. But certainly, everybody should think about how it can be a benefit to them by thinking about doing it.
And this is just one of the things that I learned after talking to Obren about how if this is the petty in me that found this very interesting. But let's say you have kids and you want to like skip your kids and like make sure your grandkids are cool. Like, there's a way to do that.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things about estate planning is that you can literally parent from the grave, and one of the things that I have conversations with my clients about is, you know your kids. And I just had, literally, in the last 2 weeks, I had a client, and we were having conversations, and my client has, 2 daughters. And, one daughter, when we were talking about them, because I asked about, your family, tell me about your kids. And he said, one daughter, if you give her $1 a day, it's going to be gone tomorrow. She is not the best money manager. She's a living in the moment, live for the day kind of person. His other daughter probably has the first dollar she ever earned babysitting because she's an incredible money manager. And so when we started talking about it, for him, who's going to be responsible for handling financial issues if he were to have a stroke and became disabled for some period of time? Mm-hmm. Well, hands down, it was a daughter that was a good money manager, right? And in terms of the health issues and healthcare, the daughter that wasn't a great money manager would be a much better health advocate for him to advocate on his behalf. But then, as we continue to drill down and say, well, you're not here anymore, where you leave everything you have to your kids, again, let's take into consideration how they are as money managers in terms of how you want to leave what you're leaving to them. And for the one that was the one that doesn't handle money well, he wanted most of what he was going to leave to her to be able to go to his grandchild, her daughter, to make sure she would have a good college education, because he didn't have the confidence to think she'd be able to save for college. Mm-hmm. He was able to put the other daughter in complete control of whatever he leaves her, because he knows that she's going to be a great money manager and will grow whatever it is that he leaves for her. Mm-hmm. And so it allows you to parent after you're here, and to parent to the specific needs of your particular family members that you know better than anybody else.
No, that's important. We all know we got those family members, honey.
Like,
Ooh, we got those family members, and then stuff happens, and then yeah. So is there a way to use estate planning as a wealth preservation strategy before you pass away?
well, before you pass away, your wealth building strategy is going to be you, right? You're saving, you're investing, the things that you do to build your wealth, buying real estate, rental properties, whatever it is you want to do, that's going to be your plan. But your estate plan is going to be the conduit to make sure that what you amass goes to who you want it to go to without having to be reduced by taxes, fees, and other things, because that may happen if you don't take the steps to plan.
Mm-hmm. And that's the interesting thing, because I'm just talking it over, and I never considered estate planning because I didn't feel like it mattered if I was single with no kids. But what I didn't really process is how, if you pass away, the government is going to take their thing, but if you have a plan in place that actually protects you in taxes and creditors and even divorce.
Absolutely. Probably the number one thing. I mean, the divorce rate being what it is currently, we know that, couples are more likely to get divorced than to stay married in these days and times. And, many times if you happen to be a parent and you got kids, whatever you want to leave your child, you want your child to get. You don't want it to be community property where that spouse is going to get half of what you leave. And if you leave your kids some money or what you spend your lifetime building, and they take that and put that into their joint bank account and get divorced, it's going to be at risk for being tied up in a divorce proceeding. But if you put it in trust for them, you're able to keep that completely segregated for your child, regardless of what happens in their personal situation. And so you can end up putting whatever you leave for them and make sure it's going to go exactly to them or to your grandkids.
Mm-hmm. So Oprah and I have come together to do a master class. He's teaching it, of course. I don't know nothing about it.
You're teaching it.
No. So Oprah's going to teach us more about estate planning, and his masterclass is completely free. It's educational, all of that. I'm going to put the link in the description for anyone who's interested. We're going to do that coming up soon. And if, more people are interested, we'll, do it again in the future. But for me, this was important because I've, seen people make some mistakes in this, and as I have various assets, when I think about it, I don't want it to go to the government. Even if I don't have no kids, I gotta find somebody to give it to. So I gotta figure that.
Or to your creditors. I mean, realistically.
Right. That part. So what are some things that you think people should know in regards to estate planning that they don't even consider?
Well, I think a well-drafted estate plan is going to be able to take care of you in a couple of situations. One, obviously, when you pass away, making sure that what you have goes to who you want it to go to in the way that's most cost-effective and tax-smart. That's one. But two, people don't think about the fact that if you have a well-crafted estate plan, it's also going to incorporate taking care of you and providing for you if you become incapacitated or disabled. Statistics tell us that we are more likely to go through a period of incapacity before we end up dying. And so that could be a very expensive proposition if you haven't taken the steps to put things in place as to who is going to be the person responsible for making decisions for you if you're not in a position to make decisions for yourself. And again, I think that's probably something very important, particularly if you're moving abroad. Again, if you're living in a country outside the U.S., is there somebody that you're close to in the country that you're living in that you want to be able to make medical decisions for you? And maybe they can be one of your healthcare agents along with whoever the person is back stateside that you have a lot of confidence in. And maybe though you can empower both of those folks to be able to be in communication to make the best decisions for you. So it's about being proactive. At the end of the day, that's what it really comes down to.
Mm-hmm. And so for those of you who are considering moving abroad and you're retiring, this is incredibly important to you. So obviously we can't give you a blanket education as to how each country handles what. Okay, so you're going to have to find that team if you want to protect assets. If you are living off of your retirement account in another country and something happens to you, do you want the rest of your retirement account to just go to the federal government? So I really want you guys to think about this. If you can join Obren on the masterclass, that would be great, because I feel like Obren, he's cleared up a lot of questions that I've had, and just things we just don't consider. You feel like you're gonna have this free, wonderful life abroad, and you still gotta do some things. Particularly if you're retiring, you have real estate, you have kids that you left, adult children that you left back. You really want to consider that. So, last question: what are some of the common mistakes you see people make?
So one of the things that I see all the time, and before I move to that, let me say one thing about what you just said. Because if you're retiring and you're moving outside the United States abroad, one of the things you're able to do is, once you create your power of attorney for somebody to be able to make decisions for you, if something were to happen, you also can have a document where you can empower that person to do it even if you are still capable. In other words, you can empower a trustee to be able to make decisions for you even if you're fine. And so that might be something that you need to do or think about doing, to have a co-trustee stateside that can deal with the government as it relates to your retirement if you end up getting not the right amount of money in your annuity or whatever amount of payments you're supposed to get. You're living abroad. It's going to be very difficult to get a plane ticket to fly back, to have to run around and deal with government agencies trying to figure that out, when you can simply have somebody stateside that you can empower as your trustee to handle those things for you. So again, I mean, it just makes sense, particularly if you're going outside the country. To your second point, what are some things that I have seen that are problematic? Well, particularly in communities of color, a lot of the estate planning you see is somebody wanting to add a child to their deed or their account. And that's their way of estate planning. And that can give you some unintended consequences. And I'll give you a very quick story that will illustrate what I mean. There was a mom, and she had three daughters. One daughter lived in California, one daughter lived in New York, and then one daughter lived in the Washington metropolitan area where mom lived. And mom had a will, and her will was explicit. It said if anything were to happen to her, she wanted everything that she owned to be split equally between her three daughters that she loved dearly. Crystal clear. That was mom's will. That's what it said. Now, most of mom's resources were in a bank account that she had. And so mom ended up passing away. The daughter came in from California. The daughter came in from New York. And then the daughter that was here. And so mom had ended up um, putting the daughter that was in the Washington metropolitan area on the account and added her as a co-owner to help her with bill pay and things of that nature. When all the daughters came together, the daughter in the Washington area said, "Oh yeah, right. Last week when mom, right before she passed, she told me she wanted me to have all the money in the bank account." Now, her will specifically said that everything she owned was to be divided equally between her three daughters. Do you think that the three daughters were end up able to get access to the money, or did it all go to the one daughter?
So the like a will, showing my ignorance, like a will and the estate plan are different.
A will is a component of the estate
It's a
plan.
component
So
of it. Okay.
let me bring that point home. In that situation, the daughter, because mom added her as a co-owner on that account, the minute mom passed, that account became 100% owned by that daughter. And so in that moment that mom passed, that account became the daughter's account, and it passed outside of her estate. The will that mom had dealt with everything that was in her estate. But because that property, that bank account passed outside of her estate, it wasn't part of the equation. That's where most of her money was. Now I can tell you that those three daughters, the two and the one, no longer speak anymore. And that's exactly what mom didn't want to have. But that was her mechanism of trying to do something that seemed pretty innocuous, but ended up being exactly what she didn't want. And things like that happen all the time. I know a lot of older parents that will add a child, on their deed to their property, not realizing that the child's not necessarily a good money manager. So then the child gets some financial difficulty, ends up getting a bankruptcy, loses their job, or maybe it's not just a bankruptcy. Maybe they have a lot of student loans and they don't have employment, and now they get behind. Now, in that financial challenges that the child is having, it's putting the house at risk because that's an asset now that creditors can go after. And the parent can end up losing their house in a bankruptcy or a creditor proceeding. So there are a lot of ways to do it wrong,
Right.
but there's very distinct ways to do it right.
Right. And so if you're listening, the will is just a component of the estate plan. You still have to put out some instructions and make things very important. And for those of you who are living abroad, really consider it. But also if you are still living in the United States. So again, you want to find out what is required in the country in which you're living, particularly if you're retiring and you left your kids in another country and you are frolicking in Portugal.
I like Portugal.
Everybody want to come to Portugal. This is my last question. So for let's say you come from a very special family and you need a trustee, but this trustee, is taking on a lot of responsibility. So is there a way to find a trustee or that you could literally trust that's not your family? Like, how would you do that if you're single, no kids, and you need a trustee? Like, how's that work?
Absolutely. So if you don't have a person, a family member, or somebody you're close to, you can get a corporate fiduciary. You can get an attorney or a trust department at a bank. There are a variety of corporate fiduciaries that will charge an annual fee to follow the instructions in your trust and do what it is you want them to do. So you don't have to worry about a family member that you can't rely on or trust. Absolutely.
Okay, that's good to know. So for those of you, because I know I'm going to get the questions, like, what do you do for Portugal specifically? I don't know. I'm just learning that I'm supposed to do this. But I will go through this journey, at least as it relates to Portugal, and I will keep you abreast on that process. But definitely it's something that everyone should consider, particularly if you're coming from the U.S. and knowing what the laws and the things are with that. And so, yeah. So, Obren, thank you so much for coming and talking to us. I know folks didn't want to come off morbid, but I do feel like it's super important just with some of the mistakes that I've been seeing in the short amount of time that I've been living abroad, that, when you don't plan for something and it occurs, it is hectic. Particularly if you still have stuff in the States that you need to correct. So please consider it. Again, Obren's going to have his master class. I feel like it's January 19th, but I will put, is it? Okay. January 19th. The link is going to be in the description to register. It's completely free. It's just educational. So just get the information so that you know how to operate out here, okay, and just be safe. So I always appreciate that you can spend your time with anyone and you decide to spend it with me, and I appreciate that. I don't take that lightly. And till next time.
Thanks for having me, Susan.
Absolutely.